There are monsters that don't hide under beds. They sit at dinner tables, say grace before meals, and call themselves family. The story I'm sharing today is one of the heaviest you'll ever hear, and it's taken me decades to find the courage to speak it aloud. My name is Isabella Grace Williams, and I'm now 79 years old, carrying over half a century of silence on my shoulders like a weight I never thought I could bear. I was born and lived my entire childhood in rural Alabama, in a small town where the summer heat pressed down like a suffocating blanket. And family, secrets were guarded more fiercely than any treasure. Most people around here know me simply as Grandma Bella, the silver-haired woman who bakes the best apple pies for the Sunday church social and never misses morning service. Few could ever imagine what I've carried inside me since I was 11 years old. Sharing this story affects me deeply, so I'd truly appreciate if you'd take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel to show your support. I also want to connect with you in the comments. Please share where you're watching from. I feel it's finally time to tell my story. Not for me. I've learned to carry this burden. But for all the children who, like me, had their innocence stolen by the very hands that should have protected them. Perhaps by hearing my account, someone will find the courage to act before silence becomes a lifelong prison. Throughout that long morning, her condition deteriorated rapidly. The fever climbed higher. Her breathing became more labored, each breath a visible struggle. My father, who would normally be in the fields at that hour, hadn't ventured out due to the heavy rain that showed no signs of stopping. When he saw Mama's condition, his face hardened with worry and determination. "I'm taking Margaret to the hospital in Montgomery," he announced, referring to the larger town about 30 miles away, where there was a proper medical facility. "Isabella, you're in charge of the little ones until I return." At that time, my paternal grandfather, Augustus Williams, was living with us. He had moved into our home after my grandmother's death about 9 months earlier. He was a tall man with broad shoulders, even at 69, with hands gnarled and calloused from decades working as an overseer on cotton plantations throughout the region. He had a carefully trimmed gray beard and eyes that always seemed to evaluate everything around him with a calculating coldness that made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't have explained why at the time. "I'll keep watch over the young ones, William," my grandfather said, placing his heavy hand on my father's shoulder. "Take Margaret and don't worry about anything here." My father nodded gratefully. He wrapped Mama in our heaviest quilts and carried her to the old pickup truck we used for trips to town. The last image I have of her is her pale face contrasting sharply with the dark blankets, her eyes meeting mine one final time as Daddy carried her out into that relentless rain. "Take care of your brother and sister, Bella," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the drumming of rain on our tin roof. "I'll be back soon, I promise." Those words would become an impossible promise to keep. The day dragged on with agonizing slowness. I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy for my siblings, preparing a simple lunch of cornbread and beans as Mama had taught me, and inventing games to distract them from the growing tension in the air. My grandfather remained on the front porch most of the time, smoking his corncob pipe and watching the rain that showed no signs of letting up. Occasionally he would come inside to check if we were managing all right, but he always returned to his silent vigil, rocking slowly in. "Daddy's chair." As evening approached, my worry deepened. Where was Daddy? Why weren't they returning? Had the rain made the roads impassable, forcing them to stay overnight in Montgomery? Around 7 o'clock, I put my siblings to bed. Samuel, old enough to sense that something serious was happening, took a long time to fall asleep, his 8-year-old mind wrestling with fears he couldn't quite name. Rebecca, too young to fully understand the gravity of the situation, fell asleep quickly after I told her one of Mama's favorite stories about brave princesses and magical kingdoms. It was nearly 9 o'clock when I heard the rumble of our truck's engine in the muddy yard. I ran to the window, my heart racing with hope of seeing Mama returning home, perhaps feeling better after treatment at the hospital. But it was only Daddy, alone, soaked to the bone by the rain that now fell in torrents. When he stepped through our front door, I immediately knew that something terrible had happened. His eyes were red and swollen from crying, and his normally straight shoulders were bent like those of a much older man. He removed his wet hat and held it against his chest, as if standing before a coffin. "Where's Mama?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from the devastation written across his face. "Your mother?" he began, but his voice failed him. He swallowed hard before continuing. "Margaret didn't make it, daughter. It was pneumonia, very advanced. The doctor said there was nothing more they could do. The world seemed to collapse around me. How could it be possible? Mama had been there, just that morning, trying to smile despite her fever. How could she be gone forever in just one day? The concept was too enormous for my 11-year-old mind to grasp. My father pulled me into his arms, his wet clothes soaking through my cotton dress, but I hardly noticed. We stood like that for what felt like hours, sharing a grief that no words could express. My grandfather watched from the kitchen doorway, his face as impassive as always, showing no emotion at this devastating news. "The arrangements for the wake are already being made," Daddy finally said, pulling back slightly to look at me. "Tomorrow morning, I'll bring her home. I'll need you to be strong, Isabella, for the little ones." I nodded, swallowing my tears with a maturity that no child should have to possess. I had always been the responsible daughter, the one who helped Mama with everything. Now I would need to be even more so. "Go rest, son," my grandfather said to my father, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "The journey was long, and tomorrow will be a difficult day. I'll keep watch over the little ones with Isabella." My father looked at me hesitantly, but exhaustion was evident in every line of his face, every slump of his shoulders. "Try to get some sleep, daughter," he said softly. "I know it's hard, but you'll need your strength tomorrow." I nodded again, though I knew sleep would be impossible that night. Daddy went to his bedroom, the one he had shared with Mama until just hours before. The muffled sound of his sobbing penetrated the thin walls of our house for what felt like an eternity. Sat at our kitchen table staring at nothing, my mind numb with shock and grief. The rain continued its relentless assault outside, as if the sky itself was mourning my mother's passing. My grandfather sat across from me, pouring himself a generous measure of the whiskey we kept for rare visitors and medicinal purposes. "Take a sip," he said, sliding the glass toward me. "It helps numb the pain." I hesitated. I had never consumed alcohol in my life, and I knew Mama wouldn't approve. But Mama wasn't there anymore, and the pain in my chest felt like it might swallow me whole. My childhood home was a modest wooden house painted pale yellow, with a wraparound porch where my mother placed clay pots filled with bright marigolds. We were a simple family, much like most in our area during the late 1950s. My father, William, worked tirelessly in the tobacco fields, leaving before dawn and returning when the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. My mother, Margaret, besides managing our household and caring for her children, baked cornbread and preserves to sell to neighbors, adding precious dollars to our modest income. I was the eldest of 3 children. After me came Samuel, 3 years younger, and little Rebecca, who had just turned 6. Our life was simple but rich in its own way, marked by honest work and small pleasures, the aroma of fresh bread wafting from our kitchen in the late afternoon, the stories my mother told us before bedtime, swimming in the creek during those sweltering summer days when the heat seemed to shimmer off the ground like liquid fire. We were poor by most standards, but we were happy in our own way. That happiness lasted until tragedy knocked on our door on that fateful day, May 15th, 1958. The morning began overcast, with a fine, persistent drizzle that seemed to press down on everything like a gray blanket. I woke earlier than usual to the sound of my mother's coughing from the next room. It wasn't an ordinary cough. It was deep, ragged, as if something was tearing apart inside her chest. When I crept into my parents' room, I found Mama lying in bed, her face flushed with fever, her lips tinged with a strange blue coloration that I didn't understand then but now recognize as cyanosis. "Mama, are you all right?" I asked, frightened by seeing her in such a state. She tried to smile, but the effort seemed to cost her everything. "Just a touch of the flu, my little flower," she whispered. "It'll pass soon enough." But it didn't pass. I accepted the glass and took a small sip. The liquid burned my throat, making my eyes water even more than they already were. But there was something oddly comforting about the warmth that spread through my chest, temporarily dulling the sharp edges of my grief. "That's right," my grandfather murmured, refilling the glass when I finished. "Life is hard, Isabella. Better to learn that lesson early. I don't remember how many drinks I had that night. I only know that gradually, the world began to blur around, the edges, my thoughts becoming confused and scattered like leaves in a windstorm. At some point, my grandfather rose from his chair and came to my side. "Come," he said, his voice strangely soft as he helped me to my feet. "I'll help you to bed." But he didn't take me to the room I shared with Rebecca. Instead, he led me to his own room at the back of the house, away from where my siblings slept. In my confusion and overwhelming sadness, I didn't question this decision. Perhaps I thought it was better not to disturb little Rebecca with my crying. Perhaps the alcohol had clouded my judgment more than I realized. What happened next remained buried in the darkest corners of my memory for many years, fragments only, like pieces of a shattered mirror that cut whenever I tried to piece them together. The memories come in jagged pieces even now, all these decades later. Rough hands where they shouldn't be. Sharp pain that I was too young to understand. The crushing weight of an adult body on my small frame, too small to resist, too confused to comprehend what was happening. The smell of whiskey and tobacco mixed with hot breath against my face, whispered words that still haunt my nightmares. "Now you're the woman of the house, Isabella. This is what women do for their families." At some point, I must have lost consciousness because my next clear memory is of dawn light filtering through the thin curtains of my own room. I was lying next to Rebecca, who slept peacefully, blissfully unaware of the new and terrible reality that surrounded us. For a brief, blessed moment, I thought everything— Mama's illness, her death, what happened afterward— had been nothing more than a cruel nightmare born of grief and fear. Then I felt the physical pain radiating through my small body. I saw the bruises on my arms, dark purple marks like fingerprints pressed into my skin. I noticed the bloodstains on my nightgown and on the sheet beneath me. It hadn't been a nightmare. It was all horrifyingly real. My mother was truly dead, and on the same day I lost her, I had also lost my innocence, my childhood, My basic trust in the world and the people who were supposed to protect me. In that moment, something fundamental inside me shut down completely. An iron gate descended over my emotions, locking everything dangerous safely inside where it couldn't hurt me further. Or so I believed. I rose carefully, moving slowly so as not to wake Rebecca. I changed into a clean dress, washed my face in the basin of cold water we kept in our room, and looked at myself in the small cracked mirror hanging on the wall. A different person stared back at me, still with the face of an 11-year-old girl, but with eyes that had aged decades in a single night. Eyes that had seen too much, endured too much, knew too much about the darkness that could lurk in places where it should never exist. I went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast, just as Mama used to do. It was the day of her wake, and I knew our house would soon be filled with neighbors and relatives offering condolences and bringing food. Normalcy became my only refuge, the only thing standing between me and complete collapse. If I could just keep moving, keep performing the familiar tasks, maybe I could hold myself together long enough to get through this impossible day. My father was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. His eyes were swollen from crying, his face marked by a night of unbearable grief. When he saw me, he pulled me into another embrace, and I needed every ounce of my newfound inner strength not to break down completely in his arms, not to scream the truth about what had happened while he was away, mourning his wife and trusting his father to protect his children. "I'm going to collect your mother now," he said, his voice hollow with exhaustion and sorrow. "Take care of the little ones when they wake up." I nodded mechanically. Take care of the little ones. That's what I would do from that day forward. Take care of the little ones and keep silent about everything else. Because who would believe me? Who would stand against the word of a respected man like my grandfather? And how could I bring even more pain to my father, who had just lost the love of his life? So began my long winter of silence, the day I lost my mother, and so much more. The day I learned, in the cruelest way possible, that the world was not a safe place, especially for girls. The day I learned that sometimes the most dangerous monsters share our own blood, and I stayed silent for so long that I almost forgot what it felt like to have a voice, until something happened that changed everything. But that part of my story will have to wait for our next meeting. The days following Mama's burial passed like a dense fog rolling across the cotton fields on a cold Alabama morning. The wake was a blur of familiar faces, embraces that couldn't warm the chill in my bones, and words of comfort that never quite reached my ears. I remember only fragments. The simple pine coffin that seemed too small to contain all that Mama had been, her face too pale and serene, looking like a wax figure rather than the vibrant woman who had hummed while kneading biscuit dough. And how I held my siblings' hands with desperate tightness throughout the entire ordeal. Samuel, at 8 years old, understood enough to cry almost continuously. Rebecca, too young to grasp the finality of death, kept asking when Mama would wake up from her long sleep. Each innocent question was like a knife twisting in my chest. In our small community, grief followed its own ancient rituals. The women of the town took over our kitchen, filling every available surface with food that would last for weeks. Ham biscuits, green bean casseroles, fruit preserves, smoked meats, and wheels of cheese. The men took turns helping Daddy in the tobacco fields, understanding that he wouldn't be able to manage everything alone during those first devastating weeks. This outpouring of community support was the only tangible comfort during those dark days. But gradually, as life demanded attention to its own urgent rhythms, the visits decreased. people returned to their own routines, their own concerns, their own lives. Within a week of the burial, we were alone again. Just us. A father consumed by grief, 3 motherless children, and a grandfather whose eyes now followed me around the house like a predator stalking its prey. My father, drowning in his own ocean of loss, barely noticed what was happening around him. He left before sunrise and returned at sunset, falling into bed exhausted, with no energy for anything beyond basic survival. I think the physical labor in the fields was his only escape, the only way he could endure Mama's absence. Perhaps he believed that if he exhausted himself enough, he wouldn't dream of her at night. "You're being such a good girl, Bella," he would sometimes say, running his work-roughened hand over my hair. "Your Mama would be so proud of how you're taking care of everyone." Those words, meant to comfort, caused me deep anguish instead. If he knew what was happening when he was away, would he still look at me with that pride shining in his tired eyes? I assumed all the household responsibilities as best I could, with my small hands and limited experience. I woke before dawn to prepare breakfast, helped my siblings dress for the one-room schoolhouse that sat 2 miles down our dusty road, washed clothes in the stone basin behind our house, and cooked meals with recipes I was still learning. My small hands tried desperately to recreate Mama's practiced gestures, but everything came out different. The cornbread was never as fluffy. The beans lacked her special seasoning. The clothes never came as clean. Each failure served as a painful reminder of her irreplaceable absence. At night, when everyone else was asleep, I cried silently into my pillow, muffling my sobs so I wouldn't wake Rebecca, who slept peacefully beside me. I cried for Mama, for myself, for the crushing weight of responsibilities that were far too heavy for such young shoulders. But mostly, I cried from the terror that grew in my chest, like a malignant tumor, every time I found myself alone with my grandfather. After that first horrific night, he became more careful, more methodical in his approach. He waited for moments when Daddy went to town for supplies, when my siblings were at school or playing with neighbor children, when the house was empty, except for the 2 of us. There was always an excuse, always a reason he needed my help that couldn't wait. "Come help me with this, Isabella," he would say in that gruff voice that allowed no refusal, and I would go, my body trembling with dread, knowing what awaited me but feeling utterly powerless to escape. What choice did an 11-year-old girl have in 1958, when children were expected to be seen and not heard, when the word of an adult, especially a respected man in the community, was unquestionable law? He always used the same words afterward, the same manipulation that kept me trapped in silence. "This stays between us, Isabella. Your father already has enough problems with losing your Mama. You don't want to cause him more suffering, do you? You don't want to be responsible for destroying what's left of this family?" And so he silenced me, using my love for my father as a weapon against me. It was a cruel and calculated form of emotional manipulation that I, in my innocence and youth, had no way to recognize or combat. I truly believed that telling the truth would kill Daddy with grief, that it would be my fault if our family, already fragile from Mama's loss, completely disintegrated. The guilt of that imagined responsibility was almost as crushing as the abuse itself. The months that followed dragged by in this continuous nightmare. Winter arrived with unusual severity for Alabama, bringing frosts that whitened the cotton, fields in the early morning, and nights so cold we could see our breath inside the house despite our wood-burning stove. On the days when the wind was fiercest, cutting through our thin walls like icy knives, I almost welcomed the bitter cold that allowed me to wear multiple layers of clothing, creating one more barrier between me and the hands that violated me. Over time, I learned to mentally remove myself during those horrific moments. While my body was trapped there, enduring the unendurable, my mind escaped to distant places, to the stories Mama used to tell about brave princesses and magical kingdoms, to the green meadows where we picked wildflowers in spring, to some distant future where I would be grown up enough and strong enough to take my siblings far away from this place. It was a form of psychological survival, a dissociation that allowed me to endure what should have been unbearable. I didn't know then that I was developing coping mechanisms that would serve me throughout my life, even as they left their own invisible scars. In August of that year, when I turned 12, I realized with growing horror that my body was beginning to change. Small tender buds appeared on my chest, announcing a puberty that seemed to arrive far too early. These changes only worsened my situation, drawing even more unwanted attention from my grandfather. "Turning into a young lady, aren't you?" he commented one day, his eyes traveling over my developing body in a way that made my skin crawl. "Your mama developed early, too. Ran in the family, I suppose." I tried desperately to hide these changes. I wore the loosest clothes I could find, hunched my shoulders to appear smaller, even bound my chest with strips of cloth torn from old sheets. Anything to look younger, less visible, less appealing to his predatory gaze. But it was useless. The changes were happening whether I wanted them to or not, and he noticed everything. That summer brought frequent visits from a distant relative, Aunt Louise, Daddy's cousin, a widow in her 50s who lived in the county seat. She came on Sundays, bringing store-bought cakes and penny candy for us children, and observing our situation with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than others did. "This girl is far too thin," she commented to my father one afternoon, studying my face with obvious concern. "And those eyes, they look like they belong to someone much older than 12. It was the first time anyone had noticed that something might be wrong. I felt a complex mixture of hope and terror coursing through me. Part of me desperately wanted her to discover everything, to take this terrible secret away from me and make it someone else's problem to solve. But another part of me trembled with fear. Fear of the consequences. Fear of not being believed. Fear of causing the very destruction of our family that my grandfather had warned me about. My grandfather quickly perceived the potential danger that Aunt Louise represented. He became notably more cautious when she was around, treating me with a calculated distance that could easily be mistaken for appropriate respect and propriety. But his eyes still sent me clear, silent messages. "You belong to me. No one would believe you anyway. You have no choice but to remain silent." As time passed, I began developing small acts of resistance, tiny rebellions that probably went unnoticed by others, but represented important victories in the silent war I was waging for my own survival. I began sleeping with a pair of sewing scissors hidden under my pillow, telling myself that somehow these small, sharp tools might give me some measure of protection, though deep down, I knew a 12-year-old girl was no match for a grown man's strength. I started waking before everyone else to barricade the door of the room I shared with Rebecca, pushing our small dresser against it, and claiming I was afraid of storms when anyone questioned the blocked entrance. I invented illnesses when I sensed I would be alone with him, claiming stomach aches or headaches severe enough to require staying in bed with Rebecca beside me, as my unwitting protector. But my greatest weapon became careful observation. Not the helpless watching of a victim, but the calculated study of a strategist. I learned to read the warning signs, to predict his moods and movements, to anticipate when it would be safer to stay near other people, and when it was better to hide. I discovered a secret hiding place in the hayloft of our old barn, a space He never found where I could disappear for hours when his behavior became particularly threatening. It wasn't much, but it was mine. A small pocket of safety in a world that felt increasingly dangerous. In March of 1959, almost a year after Mama's death, something happened that would change the course of our family's history forever. It was a Saturday. I remember that detail clearly because Daddy had planned to spend the day working on repairs around the house instead of going to the fields. Samuel and Rebecca were at the neighbor's farm, helping with the birth of new calves and expecting to stay for supper. I was alone in the house with my grandfather, scrubbing the kitchen floor with lye soap and hot water, when he appeared in the doorway. The late afternoon sun was streaming through our windows, creating long shadows that seemed to reach toward me like grasping fingers. "Come here, Isabella," he ordered in that tone I had learned to dread, a voice that allowed no refusal, no negotiation. My heart began racing with familiar terror. I knew that tone, that particular look in his eyes. I had seen it too many times before, and I knew exactly what it meant. But that day, something inside me rebelled. Perhaps it was the accumulation of nearly a year of living in constant fear. Perhaps it was the memory of Mama, which seemed particularly vivid that afternoon as I worked in her kitchen using her recipes, trying to fill the enormous void she had left behind. Perhaps it was simply that my capacity for enduring the unendurable had finally reached its limit. "I can't right now," I answered without looking up at him, continuing to scrub the wooden floorboards with more force than necessary. "I need to finish this before Daddy comes back from town." He seemed stunned for a moment. I had never directly disobeyed him before, never dared to refuse his commands so explicitly. But his surprise quickly transformed into something much more dangerous, a cold, controlled anger that made the air in the kitchen feel thick and threatening. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides, grabbed my arm with enough force to leave finger-shaped bruises, and began dragging me toward his bedroom, at the back of the house. "Who do you think you are to speak to me like that?" He growled through clenched teeth, his grip tightening painfully on my thin arm. "Have you forgotten who's in charge of this house while your father's away?" I fought back for the first time, truly fought back. I scratched at his hands, kicked at his shins, tried to twist away from his grasp. It was useless against an adult man's superior strength, but I continued struggling anyway. Something fundamental had broken inside me. If this was going to happen regardless of my compliance, then at least I wouldn't be submissive. At least I would make it difficult for him. That's when we heard the distinctive sound of Daddy's truck pulling into our yard. The engine's familiar, rumble cutting through the afternoon air like a rescue bell. My grandfather froze, his hand still gripping my arm with brutal force. We weren't expecting Daddy back for at least another hour. He had gone to town to sell some of our tobacco crop and purchase supplies for the coming week. My grandfather released me abruptly, pushing me away from him so suddenly that I stumbled and nearly fell against the kitchen table. "Go see who that is," he hissed, his voice low and threatening. "And not a word about this. Do you understand me?" I ran to the window, my heart pounding with a mixture of relief and lingering terror. It was indeed Daddy's truck, returning much earlier than expected, the faded red paint looking like the most beautiful sight in the world to my desperate eyes. My grandfather quickly disappeared to his room, and I tried frantically to compose myself before Daddy entered the house. I smoothed my apron, attempted to fix my disheveled hair, and took deep breaths to control the tears that threatened to spill over. Daddy came through the front door carrying a burlap sack of supplies and a small package wrapped in brown paper. that I later discovered contained fabric for a new dress he had somehow found the money to buy for me. His face, normally marked by the persistent sadness that had settled there since Mama's death, seemed somewhat lighter that day, as if the simple act of providing for his family had lifted his spirits slightly. "I came back early," he explained, setting the groceries on our kitchen table. "There's a bad storm coming in from the west. I thought it best not to risk getting caught on the muddy roads." Indeed, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, heralding one of those violent spring storms that could transform dirt roads into impassable rivers of mud within minutes. I helped him unpack the supplies, trying desperately to act normal. But my arm throbbed where my grandfather had gripped it, and my heart still beat erratically from our interrupted confrontation. Daddy observed me carefully as we organized everything, his sharp eyes, so much like my own, taking in details that others might have missed. At one point, his work-roughened hand accidentally brushed against my arm exactly where my grandfather's fingers had left their mark. I instinctively recoiled with a sharp intake of breath, a sound of pain that I couldn't quite suppress. "What's that on your arm, Bella?" he asked, his brow furrowing with concern as he gently pushed up my sleeve to reveal the darkening bruises. "Nothing," I answered quickly, pulling my arm away and tugging my sleeve back down. "I bumped it when I was cleaning under the table earlier." He didn't seem convinced. His eyes, those familiar brown eyes that I had inherited from him, studied my face for a long, uncomfortable moment, as if he were trying to read a message written in a language he didn't quite understand. "Is there something happening here that I should know about?" he finally asked, his voice soft but carrying an undertone of steel that I had rarely heard before. The words caught in my throat like thorns. Here was my chance, my opportunity to tell him everything, to end this nightmare once and for all. But the fear that had been carefully cultivated over months of manipulation paralyzed me completely. Fear of not being believed, fear of the consequences, fear of destroying what remained of our already fractured family. "No, Daddy," I lied, lowering my eyes so he wouldn't see the truth that I was certain must be written clearly across my face. "Everything's fine, I promise." He sighed deeply, a sound that carried more weight than any 12-year-old should have to bear. But he didn't press the issue further. Instead, he briefly caressed my hair with one gentle hand before going to find my grandfather and discuss the approaching storm. The first rumbles of thunder began to sound in the distance, announcing the arrival of the weather that would keep us all trapped inside together for the next several hours. Inside me, another kind of storm was forming, one made of guilt for not taking advantage of that precious opportunity, relief for having escaped immediate danger, and a new feeling that I was almost afraid to acknowledge. Hope. Daddy had noticed something. He had asked questions. He was paying attention in a way he hadn't since Mama's death. Maybe, just maybe, not everything was lost. After all. What I didn't know at that moment was that the real storm brewing in our family was far more powerful than any weather system nature could produce, and it was about to break with a force that would change our lives forever. The storm that began forming that March afternoon of 1959 wasn't just the one darkening the Alabama sky. There was another far more dangerous tempest building within the walls of our modest yellow house, one charged with secrets, suspicion, and a father's growing awareness that something terrible was happening to his daughter. The days following that incident in the kitchen were filled with an almost suffocating tension. My grandfather, for the first time since this nightmare began, seemed genuinely cautious around me. He cast glances in my direction that mixed threat with something I had never seen before: apprehension. My father, meanwhile, observed both of us with a renewed attention that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. It was as if he had awakened from the fog of mourning that had enveloped him since Mama's death, and now he was seeing our household with clear, sharp eyes. For the first time in nearly a year, something fundamental had shifted in Daddy's behavior. He began arriving home earlier from the tobacco fields, asking detailed questions about our day, noticing small things that had previously gone unobserved in his haze of grief. Sometimes I caught him watching me with a questioning expression, as if he were trying to decipher a complex puzzle written in a language he was just beginning to understand. Other times I glimpsed him engaged in whispered conversations with my grandfather, discussions that ceased abruptly whenever I entered the room. Our house routine continued its apparent normalcy on the surface. I maintained my responsibilities, caring for the household, looking after my siblings, cooking meals with increasing skill, washing clothes, and mending torn garments. But something subtle and significant had changed in our family dynamic. The opportunities my grandfather found to isolate me diminished dramatically, not from any lack of trying on his part, but because Daddy seemed to materialize at critical moments, appearing unexpectedly when his presence was most needed and most protective. On a particularly cold April evening, when autumn was painting the leaves in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, the confrontation I had secretly both feared and hoped for finally occurred. My siblings were already fast asleep in their beds, and I was finishing the evening's dishes in our dimly lit kitchen. The only illumination came from the kerosene lamp hanging above our table, and the orange glow that escaped through the gaps around our wood stove door. The familiar sounds of crickets and a distant dog's lonely howl were the only noises beyond the rhythmic scraping of my cloth against the dinner plates. My grandfather entered the kitchen with that heavy but silent walk I had learned to recognize and dread, the predatory approach of someone who believed himself to be completely in control of the situation. Daddy had stepped outside to investigate what he claimed was a suspicious noise coming from the tool shed, or at least, that's what he had announced before leaving the house. Looking back now, I realized this was no coincidence. It was a carefully orchestrated trap. "Alone at last, Isabella!" My grandfather's voice rumbled low behind me, making every muscle in my body tense with familiar terror. I nodded without turning, around, my hands continuing their mechanical work of drying the dishes, as if normalcy could somehow protect me, as if I could become invisible through the simple act of completing ordinary tasks. "It's been quite a while since we've had a moment just for ourselves," he continued, moving closer until I could feel his presence like a dark shadow falling across my shoulders. "Your father's been unusually attentive lately, hasn't he?" His heavy hands descended onto my thin shoulders, and I felt my knees threaten to buckle under the weight of what I knew was coming. I closed my eyes tightly, already retreating to that distant mental sanctuary where I had learned to hide during these terrible moments. "What exactly is happening here?" My father's voice cut through the kitchen like a blade, sharp and controlled, in a way I had never heard before. I opened my eyes to see him standing in the doorway, an expression of growing fury and disbelief transforming his normally gentle features. My grandfather jerked his hands away from my shoulders as if they had been burned, taking a quick step backward and attempting to compose his expression into something resembling innocence. "Nothing of concern, son," he answered with forced casualness, though I could detect a slight tremor in his voice that had never been there before. "Just having a conversation with the girl about her household duties." A conversation? Daddy's voice remained dangerously quiet, but his eyes blazed with an intensity that made the air in the kitchen feel electric. That's not what it looked like to me. A suffocating silence descended over our kitchen, broken only by the crackling of burning wood in our stove, and the distant rumble of thunder from the approaching storm outside. I remained frozen in place, the half-dried plate still clutched in, my trembling hands unable to move or speak. I had imagined this moment countless times, the moment when my terrible secret would finally be exposed. But now that it was actually happening, I found myself completely voiceless. "Go to your room, Bella," Daddy ordered without taking his eyes off my grandfather, his voice carrying an authority I had rarely heard him use. I hesitated, torn between relief at being able to escape and terror about what might happen once I was gone. The confrontation I had both longed for and dreaded was finally beginning, and I would not be there to witness or influence its outcome. "Go," he repeated, this time with more firmness, but also with an undertone of protection that I hadn't heard since Mama was alive. I dropped the plate and dish towel onto the counter and hurried past Daddy toward the narrow hallway that led to our bedrooms. But instead of going directly to my room as instructed, I stopped in the darkness of the hallway, pressing myself against the wall where I could hear everything while remaining hidden. My heart hammered so violently against my ribs that I feared they might hear it from the kitchen. "What were you doing with my daughter?" Daddy's voice carried through the thin walls of our house, no longer quiet but filled with barely controlled rage. "I already told you," my grandfather replied, but his voice carried a subtle tremor that betrayed his growing nervousness. "We were simply discussing her responsibilities around the house. You're imagining things, William." "Am I?" Daddy's voice took on a tone that made my blood run cold, dangerous and deadly serious. "For weeks now, I've been watching you both. The bruises on her arms that she tries to hide, the way she flinches whenever you come near her, the nightmares that wake her up screaming in the middle of the night. Do you think I'm blind, or do you just think I'm stupid? She's a clumsy child, always bumping into things and hurting herself," my grandfather responded, but I could hear the defensiveness creeping into his voice. "As for the nightmares, she lost her mother. It's perfectly natural for a young girl to have troubled sleep after such a traumatic loss." "Don't you dare try to manipulate me with lies!" Daddy's voice exploded through the house, making me shrink further into the shadows of the hallway. "Last night I stayed awake, pretending to sleep. I saw you trying to enter her room. I saw you persist even when she said she was feeling sick. I saw everything." A stunned silence followed those words, and I felt a wave of profound relief wash over me. Daddy had seen. He had been watching. He had noticed far more than I had ever dared to hope. He wasn't as oblivious to my suffering as I had believed. "You don't understand the situation, William." My grandfather's voice had changed again, becoming more conciliatory, more manipulative. "The girl is confused about things. She needs guidance, a maternal figure in her life. Since she doesn't have... that sometimes she misinterprets normal affection and..." "Shut your mouth!" Daddy's voice roared through the house, and I heard the sharp sound of something ceramic shattering against the kitchen wall. "Don't you dare suggest that my daughter is lying or confused about what you've been doing to her." "I haven't done anything she didn't encourage." My grandfather's voice took on a more defiant, desperate tone. "She's been developing early, provoking me for months, offering herself like a young woman. She's just like her mother was at that age." The sound that followed was like thunder erupting inside our kitchen, the solid impact of knuckles against flesh and bone. I heard a grunt of pain and surprise. followed by the noise of furniture being knocked over, objects crashing to the floor, the sounds of a violent struggle between two grown men. "Never speak about my late wife or my daughter in that filthy way again." Daddy's voice roared above the chaos. The sounds of fighting intensified. Glass breaking, wood splintering, grunts of pain and exertion echoing through our small house. I covered my ears with my hands, terrified by the violence, but unable to block out the noise completely. Then there was a particularly loud thud, followed by a sudden, complete silence that was somehow more frightening than all the noise had been. Driven by panic and the need to know what had happened, I crept back to the kitchen doorway. The scene I discovered there will remain forever, burned into my memory with perfect, terrible clarity. My father stood in the center of our destroyed kitchen, breathing heavily, his knuckles bleeding from the fight. My grandfather lay motionless on the floor, a dark stain of blood spreading slowly beneath his head, where it had struck the sharp corner of our ironwood stove. "Daddy?" My voice came out as barely a whisper. He turned toward me, his face transformed by shock and the sudden realization of what had just occurred. For a moment, he seemed not to recognize me, as if he were looking through me toward some distant, terrible horizon. Then his gaze cleared and focused on my face. "Bella," he said, his voice breaking with emotion and exhaustion. "I told you to. Go to your room. Is he—" I couldn't complete the question, though we both knew what I was asking. Daddy knelt beside my grandfather's still form, checking for a pulse at his neck with fingers that trembled slightly. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded gravely. "Go wake Samuel," he ordered, his voice taking on a practical tone that contrasted sharply with the chaos surrounding us. "Tell him you didn't hear anything tonight, that you were sleeping soundly. Do you understand? No matter what happens from this point forward, you saw nothing and heard nothing." I nodded, terrified but strangely relieved. My grandfather was dead. The nightmare was finally over, but I was old enough to understand that another, different kind of nightmare was just beginning. "And Bella," Daddy added, grasping my shoulders, gently, and looking directly into my eyes with an intensity that made me feel as if he could see straight into my soul. "Someday, when you're older and stronger, I'm going to ask you to tell me everything that really happened in this house. Everything he did to you, but not today. Today you saw nothing. Promise me." "I promise, Daddy," I answered with a maturity that no 12-year-old should possess. The hours that followed were a confused blur of activity and carefully orchestrated deception. I remember waking Samuel with whispered instructions about our official story, that we had been sleeping peacefully and heard nothing unusual. I remember returning to my room and holding Rebecca close while she slept, her innocent breathing a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted just rooms away. I remember the sound of horses and urgent voices arriving in the middle of the night, lantern lights casting eerie shadows through the cracks around our windows, men entering and leaving our house, speaking in low, serious tones about the tragic accident that had befallen Augustus Williams. The sheriff arrived, a heavy-set man with a thick mustache and eyes that had seen too much tragedy in our small community. I listened from my bedroom as he questioned Daddy in our kitchen, right where the confrontation had taken place. "It was clearly an accident, William," I heard the sheriff conclude after examining the scene and my grandfather's body. "Anyone can see that the old man had been drinking heavily. He must have stumbled and struck his head on that stove corner. Could happen to anyone, especially a man his age with that much whiskey in him." Perhaps the sheriff genuinely believed his own assessment, or perhaps he simply preferred not to delve too deeply into the complicated dynamics of family relationships in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Either way, the official verdict was established without question or investigation. Augustus Williams, aged 70, had died from an accidental head injury sustained during a fall caused by excessive alcohol consumption. A tragic domestic accident. Nothing more. Nobody questioned this conclusion. Nobody expressed suspicion. Or if they did harbor doubts, they chose to maintain their silence, respecting the grief of a family that had already endured the devastating loss of wife and mother less than a year earlier. My grandfather's funeral was brief and sparsely attended. A few elderly men from town who had known him in his younger days, some former colleagues from his work on various plantations, but no genuine mourners. No real tears were shed over his simple pine coffin. Daddy remained stoic throughout the ceremony, fulfilling his social obligations with the quiet dignity of a man doing what was necessary, rather than what he wanted. I watched everything with a curious sense of detachment, as if I were observing a play in which I had no real part. When the plain wooden coffin was lowered into the red Alabama earth in our small community cemetery, I felt an enormous weight lift from my shoulders, as if they were burying not just a body, but the months of terror and violation that had defined my life since Mama's death. On the evening after the burial, when we had finally returned home and my siblings were fast asleep, Daddy called me to sit with him at our kitchen table, the same place where, just days before, our family's tragedy had reached its violent conclusion. The floor had been scrubbed, clean until no trace of blood remained, but we both knew what had happened there. The memory hung in the air between us like an unspoken truth. "Bella," he began, his voice low and careful so as not to wake the children sleeping in the next room. "I'm never going to ask you directly about what happened, and I won't ask you now. I don't want you to carry that burden of having to speak those words aloud." His eyes, those familiar brown eyes that had given me my own, brimmed with tears that he refused to let fall. It was the first genuine display of deep emotion I had seen from him since Mama's death. "I just want you to understand that if I did what I did tonight, it was because a father protects his children, always, no matter what the cost, no matter who threatens them, no matter what the consequences might be." He reached across the scarred wooden table and took my small hand in his work-roughened one. It was the first time we had truly connected, really talked, since Mama's passing. "Someday, when you're ready, if you ever want to talk about what happened here, I'll be waiting to listen. But if you prefer to never mention it again, that's perfectly fine too. The important thing is that now we're safe. We're all safe." "We both did what we had to do," I replied, surprising both him and myself with the firmness and clarity in my young voice. "And we're alive. That's what matters most." He looked at me with a mixture of surprise and admiration, as if he were truly seeing me, not just as his little girl, but as the strong person I was becoming, for the very first time. "You're strong, just like your mama was," he finally said, a small sad smile appearing on his tired face. "She would be so proud of the woman you're becoming." In that moment, sitting together at our kitchen table in the gentle glow of our oil lamp, something new and precious formed between us, a silent understanding, a mutual respect that transcended words and explanations, and for the first time in almost a year, I fell asleep without fear, without nightmares, without the constant shadow of the monster who had shared our roof. What I didn't realize then was that some secrets, even when buried deep in the earth along with their perpetrators, have ways of resurfacing years later, transformed by time and experience, but no less powerful in their ability to shape our lives. And although this particular dark chapter had finally come to an end, there was still a long and difficult journey of healing ahead of me, a path that would take decades to fully walk and would test me in ways I could never have imagined during that night of relative peace and newfound safety. Life has a strange and almost miraculous way of moving forward, even when it seems impossible that normalcy could ever return. After my grandfather's burial, our modest yellow house gradually ceased to be a place of fear and terror, slowly transforming back into what it should have always been, a true home. The change wasn't immediate or complete. Certain shadows linger for years in the corners of rooms and the recesses of memory, like stains that no amount of scrubbing can entirely remove. But something fundamental had shifted in our family's foundation, something that allowed healing to begin its slow, patient work. The summer of 1959 arrived with its typical Alabama intensity, bringing scorching days that cracked the red earth and humid nights that made sleep nearly impossible without the relief of evening thunderstorms. Yet, despite the relentless heat, something inside me began to slowly thaw, as if an internal winter was finally giving way to a hesitant but genuine spring. Daddy, though we never again directly discussed the events of that terrible night, began rebuilding our family with a quiet determination that I admire to this day. He assumed not just the role of provider and protector, but tried, in his awkward countryman way, to fill the enormous void that Mama's death had left in our daily lives. His calloused hands, accustomed to the rough work of tobacco farming, now attempted delicate tasks like braiding Rebecca's fine hair each morning, checking Samuel's arithmetic homework after supper, and even making simple cakes on Sundays, following the faded, flour-stained recipes that Mama had kept in an old coffee tin. "Your daddy's turning into quite the housewife," our neighbors would tease when they discovered he had learned to darn socks or patch torn clothing. But he just smiled without embarrassment or defensiveness. "My children need these things," he would respond simply. "So I learn how to do them." It was a revolutionary attitude for a widowed man in rural Alabama in 1959, where such domestic tasks were considered strictly women's work. As for me, although I continued helping with household responsibilities, Daddy insisted that I return to my education at our one-room schoolhouse. "Your mama always wanted you to get proper schooling," he would say whenever I tried to argue that I would be more useful at home. "And that's what I want for you, too. Education is the one thing nobody can ever take away from you." My return to the little school, where students ranging from 6 to 16 studied together under the patient guidance of Miss Sarah, was both a relief and a new kind of challenge. Relief because it meant hours away from our house, away from the memories that still clung to certain rooms, despite all our efforts to create new, happier associations. Relief to be among people who didn't know, who could never know, what had transpired within our walls during those dark months. But it was also challenging because at 13 years old, I carried experiences that created an invisible but impenetrable barrier between me and my classmates. I had seen and endured things that aged me far beyond my chronological years, giving me a perspective on life's darker possibilities that set me apart from their innocent concerns about playground disputes and upcoming harvest festivals. "Isabella seems to be in another world lately," Miss Sarah commented during one of her periodic conferences with Daddy. "She has real potential, learns quickly, and reads well above her grade level. But she always seems distant, as if part of her mind is somewhere else entirely." She was absolutely right, of course. Part of me was always on guard, always vigilant for potential threats, always calculating escape routes and safe spaces. The trauma had taught me to never completely lower my defenses, to trust cautiously, and to view the world through eyes that had learned too early about the monsters that could hide behind familiar faces. At night, the nightmares continued, though with decreasing frequency and intensity. I would wake screaming, my body drenched in cold sweat, terrible images still vivid behind my closed eyelids. Images of hands and shadows, and being trapped with nowhere to run. During the worst episodes, it was Daddy who came to my bedside, sitting on the edge of my narrow bed and waiting patiently until my breathing returned to normal and the terror released its grip on my heart. "It's all over now, Bella," he would whisper into the darkness of my room, his voice carrying a conviction that helped anchor me back to reality. It was just a bad dream. Nobody is ever going to hurt you again. I promise you that. He never asked about the specific content of my nightmares. We both understood what they contained, and words weren't necessary to communicate that understanding. In early 1961, when I was 14 years old, life surprised us with another significant change. Aunt Louise, that sharp-eyed cousin of Daddy's who had occasionally visited us and seemed to see more than others, found herself widowed for the second time when her elderly husband passed away from a stroke. Childless and alone in her large house in Tuscumbia, the county seat, she made a proposition that would once again alter the direction of our lives. "William," she said one Sunday afternoon, after we had shared dinner on our front porch, sipping sweet tea and watching storm clouds gather on the distant horizon. "I've been giving this considerable thought. Why don't you and the children come, live with me in town? The house is far too large for one person, and the children would have access to much better schools there." Daddy hesitated, running his weathered hand over his unshaven jaw, in the gesture I recognized as his way of thinking through complex problems. "I don't know, Louise," he finally replied. "This land has been in our family for 2 generations. It's all I really know how to do." "Nobody's suggesting you sell the farm," she responded with characteristic practicality. "Hire someone reliable to work it, or lease it to a neighbor. Come visit on weekends to check on things. But think about what's best for these children, William. What future do they have out here in the middle of nowhere?" She paused, her intelligent eyes focusing on me with particular intensity. "Isabella is becoming a young woman. She needs proper education and opportunities if she's going to make something more of herself than just somebody's farm wife." That observation struck Daddy deeply. If there was anything he wanted desperately for his children, it was opportunities that he and Mama had never had, chances to build lives beyond the limited horizons of rural poverty. The decision wasn't made that afternoon, but the seed was planted. Over the following months, the idea grew and was discussed countless times at our dinner table, weighing advantages against disadvantages, dreams against practical realities. Samuel and Rebecca were enthusiastic about the prospect of living in what they considered the big city, though Tuscumbia was really just a larger town with about 8,000 residents, electric streetlights, and a movie theater that showed films on Friday and Saturday nights. My own feelings were deeply conflicted. On one hand, the idea of leaving our house, where so much suffering had occurred, held obvious appeal. On the other hand, despite everything that had happened there, it was the only home I had ever known. Every corner of our property held memories, some painful, yes, but others precious and irreplaceable from the happier times when Mama was still alive and our family was whole and innocent. In August of 1961, during the peak of that summer's heat, we finally made the decision to move. We didn't take much with us. Some clothing, personal belongings, the family photographs that were among our most treasured possessions, and the delicate china set that had been Mama's pride and joy. Everything else stayed behind, along with a significant part of our former selves. Aunt Louise's house in Tuscumbia was genuinely impressive by the standards we were accustomed to. It was a 2-story Victorian with 4 spacious bedrooms, a parlor separate from the dining room, a large kitchen equipped with both a traditional wood-burning stove and a modern gas range, a technological advancement that seemed almost magical to us. Most luxurious of all, it had an indoor bathroom with running water, a convenience we had only dreamed about during our years of using an outhouse and washing, with water heated on the stove. "Each child will have their own bedroom," Aunt Louise announced to the obvious delight of Samuel and Rebecca, who had always shared cramped quarters and few personal possessions. Adapting to this new life proved more challenging than any of us had anticipated. Daddy, accustomed to the physical demands and natural rhythms of farm work, now found himself employed as a clerk in Henderson's general store, spending his days behind a counter, making change and keeping inventory records. His hands, once permanently stained with soil and calloused from tools, now handled account books and measured fabric by the yard. During those first weeks, he would return home each evening with a somewhat lost expression, as if he wasn't entirely sure who he was becoming in this unfamiliar environment. "It's honest work," he would say when I asked how he was adjusting, "and it pays steady wages. That's more than farming ever guaranteed us." As for me, I was enrolled in Tuscumbia Academy for Young Ladies, a prestigious institution run by the Episcopalian Church. It was a completely different world from our one-room country schoolhouse. Separate classrooms for each grade level, multiple teachers specializing in specific subjects, crisp uniforms consisting of navy blue skirts and starched white blouses, and strict rules governing everything from posture to proper penmanship. On my first day, looking at those dozens of girls in their perfectly pressed uniforms and carefully styled hair, I felt a fear and inadequacy that I hadn't experienced since the darkest days in our old house. "You'll adjust soon enough," Aunt Louise assured me, straightening my navy blue tie for what felt like the 100th time. "This is one of the finest schools in northern Alabama. A diploma from here will open doors that would otherwise remain permanently closed to you." I nodded but said nothing, doubting that I would ever truly belong in this world of privilege and refinement. The other girls came from established families, daughters of bankers, lawyers, the town's mayor, and successful merchants. I was simply the farm girl with the heavy country accent and rough manners, wearing a second-hand uniform that Aunt Louise had obtained from a family friend whose daughter had outgrown it. The first months at Tuscumbia Academy were marked by almost complete social isolation. I deliberately chose seats at the back of every classroom, spoke only when directly questioned by the teachers, and spent recess periods in the school library, ostensibly studying but really hiding from the complex social dynamics I didn't understand or trust. This wasn't merely shyness or typical adolescent awkwardness. It was a carefully constructed protective barrier that I had erected around myself, an invisible wall designed to keep the world at what felt like a safe distance. The trauma I had experienced had taught me that people, especially those in positions of authority, could not automatically be trusted, no matter how kind or helpful they appeared on the surface. Academically, however, I began to flourish in ways that surprised both my teachers and myself. I discovered that books offered something I had desperately needed, an escape into alternative worlds where I could exist safely, where the complications of my own reality couldn't reach me. Sister Margaret, the English literature teacher, was the first educator to recognize my particular talent for writing and critical analysis. "You have a genuine gift with language, Isabella," she told me one afternoon, after reading an essay I had written about the poetry of Emily Dickinson. I had somehow connected Dickinson's themes of isolation and hidden pain to my own understanding of life's darker possibilities in ways that impressed her. "You should seriously consider pursuing higher education, perhaps even a career in teaching or writing. You have insights that are quite remarkable for someone your age." It was the first time any adult had suggested that I might become something more than a housewife and mother, that I might have a destiny beyond simply repeating the patterns of previous generations. The idea took root in my mind like a seed, planted in fertile soil, fragile at first, but destined to grow into something substantial. At home, our new family dynamic gradually found its own comfortable rhythm. Aunt Louise, though sometimes overly practical and occasionally sharp-tongued, possessed a generous heart and treated us as if we were her own children rather than relatives she had taken in out of obligation. "A girl your age needs to learn much more than just academic subjects," she would tell me during our evening sessions when she taught me to embroider and crochet during the long winter nights. "You need to know how to manage a household budget, how to sew a proper seam, and how to bake bread that doesn't resemble a brick." But she also held surprisingly progressive views for a woman of her generation in rural Alabama during the early 1960s. "You also need to understand mathematics well enough so that no man can cheat you in business dealings, and you need to read extensively so that you'll have informed opinions and interesting conversation." It was a philosophy of womanhood that balanced traditional domestic skills with intellectual development, an approach that was somewhat revolutionary for the time and place, especially in the conservative South where women's roles were still quite narrowly defined. Daddy, meanwhile, seemed to gradually rediscover parts of himself that had been buried under years of grief and responsibility. The constant weight he had carried since Mama's death, intensified by the terrible events with my grandfather, began to lift as he settled into our new life. He started smiling more frequently, telling stories during dinner, playing games with Rebecca, and helping Samuel with his increasingly challenging schoolwork. On Saturday evenings, he even occasionally attended the town's social gatherings or went to the movie theater with colleagues from the general store, a level of social engagement that would have been unthinkable during our previous isolated existence. It was on one of these Saturday evenings when I was 16 years old that Aunt Louise and I had the conversation that would fundamentally change my understanding of everything that had happened in our old house and its lasting impact on my life. We were alone together that evening. Daddy had gone with Samuel to see a Western movie at the Regal Theater, and Rebecca was attending a sleepover birthday party with school friends. Aunt Louise was working on a complex needlepoint pattern, while I read a novel that Sister Margaret had recommended, enjoying the peaceful silence that had settled over our comfortable parlor. "Isabella," she said suddenly, breaking the tranquil quiet that had enveloped us. "There's something I've wanted to discuss with you for quite some time now." I looked up from my book, immediately sensing the unusual seriousness in her tone and the way she had set aside her needlework to focus entirely on me. "What is it, Aunt Louise?" She folded her hands in her lap and looked at me directly with those sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed capable of seeing straight through to a person's soul. "What really happened with your grandfather?" The question struck me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. In all the years since that terrible night, no one, absolutely no one, had asked me this question so directly and openly. It had remained our family's unspoken secret, a ghost that haunted our household but was never named or acknowledged in conversation. He slipped and hit his head on the stove," I stammered, reciting the official version that had become second nature through repetition. "It was an accident. Everyone said so." Aunt Louise continued studying my face with those penetrating eyes, as if she could read the truth written in a language invisible to others. "Isabella," she said finally, her voice becoming gentler but no less direct. "I'm asking because I need to know if my suspicions have been correct all these years. I'm not here to judge anyone or cause trouble. I simply want to understand what really happened so I can help you heal from it properly." "Understand what?" I asked defensively, though we both knew exactly what she was referring to. "I began to suspect something during my visits to your family after your mother's death," she continued, ignoring my attempted deflection. "I noticed how you would physically recoil whenever he came near you, how your eyes, so much like your mother's had been, seemed to have lost that natural light of childhood innocence. It wasn't just grief from losing Margaret. It was something much more specific and much more damaging." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing with what was clearly a difficult revelation. "I recognized the signs because I experienced something very similar when I was approximately your age. That unexpected confession shattered something deep inside me. Tears that I had successfully contained for years suddenly began streaming down my cheeks without my permission or control." "Nobody would have believed me," I whispered finally, the words emerging like a dam bursting after years of pressure. "He was respected in the community. I was just a child. People would have thought I was lying or confused or trying to cause trouble for the family. I would have believed you," she responded simply and with absolute conviction. "That's exactly why I made such an effort to become close to your family after Margaret's passing. I saw the warning signs, but I wasn't completely certain of what was happening. I couldn't intervene without concrete proof, and I was afraid of making the situation worse if I was wrong. And then," I prompted, though part of me dreaded hearing the answer. "And then your father discovered the truth," I completed, the sentence, the words now flowing like a river that could no longer be dammed. "He saw what Grandfather was trying to do to me, and they fought, and Grandfather fell and hit his head and—" I couldn't finish the sentence, but I didn't need to. Aunt Louise rose from her chair and came to sit beside me on the sofa, enveloping me in an embrace that was both protective and understanding, the kind of comfort I had desperately needed for years but had never dared to ask for. For the first time since that horrible night when my childhood ended, I allowed myself to truly cry, not the silent, suppressed sobs I had muffled against my pillow during the dark years, but an open, cleansing grief that shook my entire body and seemed to release years of accumulated pain and fear. "Your father did exactly what any decent man would have done," Aunt Louise said softly when my tears finally subsided, her arms still holding me with the fierce protectiveness of someone who truly understood. Any father worth the name would have done the same thing to protect his child. "How did you know for certain?" I asked, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand, feeling both exhausted and strangely relieved by this first honest conversation about my trauma. "How were you so sure about what was happening? When you live long enough and pay attention to the world around you, certain patterns become unmistakable," she answered with the wisdom that comes from painful experience. Then, with a deep sigh that seemed to carry decades of weight, she added, "And your father confided in me shortly after you all moved here. He needed someone to talk to about what had happened. someone he could trust with the truth. I sat in silence, absorbing this information. So Daddy had spoken about what occurred. That night, just not directly with me. The burden hadn't been his alone to carry after all. "Why are you telling me this now?" I finally asked, genuinely curious about her timing and motivations. Aunt Louise took my hands between hers, her weathered fingers warm and reassuring against my skin, her eyes meeting mine with rare intensity and compassion. "Because you've been carrying this terrible burden for far too long, Isabella. Carrying it in complete silence, believing that you needed to protect your father, your siblings, even me from the truth. But secrets like this poison the soul from within. They eat away at a person like rust, consuming iron, slowly but relentlessly." She paused, clearly considering how much more she should reveal about her own experiences. "What happened in that house was never your fault, and it wasn't your father's fault either. The only person truly responsible for the evil that occurred has already paid the ultimate price for his actions. Now it's time for you to begin the process of freeing yourself from this weight so that you can truly start living instead of merely surviving." That conversation, though painful and emotionally exhausting, marked the first genuine step in my long journey toward healing. It wasn't magical or instantaneous. Trauma doesn't disappear overnight simply because it's finally acknowledged and discussed openly. But something fundamental shifted in my psychological landscape. I was no longer completely alone with my secret. There was someone who knew the truth, who understood the depths of what I had endured, and who didn't judge me for any part I imagined I had played in those terrible events. In the years that followed, I gradually began to find my voice again. With Aunt Louise's patient guidance and my father's silent but constant support, I started to rebuild myself, not as a victim defined by what had been done to me, but as a survivor who refused to let the past determine her future. The process wasn't linear or simple. Healing never is. Each nightmare I faced down, each traumatic memory I processed and integrated, each new day I chose to live fully rather than merely endure, represented a small but significant victory against the darkness that had threatened to consume me entirely. The scars remained, of course. Some were visible only to me. The way certain unexpected sounds could make me freeze with terror, the difficulty I had trusting men in positions of authority, the hypervigilance that made me constantly aware of escape routes and potential threats. Other scars affected my relationships, my choices, my deepest fears about intimacy and vulnerability. But scars, I learned, are also evidence of healing. Silent testimonies to battles fought and won against adversities that could have destroyed me completely, but ultimately failed to do so. By the time I graduated from Tuscumbia Academy in 1964, at 17 years old, I had blossomed into a young woman who bore little resemblance to the terrified, traumatized child who had first walked through those intimidating doors. My academic achievements had earned me recognition as valedictorian, and Sister Margaret had helped me secure a scholarship to attend Alabama College for Women in Montevallo. "You have a gift that shouldn't be wasted," she told me during our final conference. "The world needs teachers who understand that education is about much more than memorizing facts. It's about nurturing the whole person, especially those students who come from difficult circumstances." I became an elementary school teacher in 1968, beginning my career at a small rural school, not unlike the one where I had received my own early education. The single large room, the worn wooden desks scarred by generations of use, the students, ranging in age from 6 to 14. Everything brought back bittersweet memories of my own childhood, both its innocent joys and its devastating sorrows. But now I stood on the other side of the equation, in the position of one who guides and protects rather than one who needs protection. It was both deeply satisfying and occasionally overwhelming to realize how much influence I could have on these young lives. It was during my first year of teaching that I met someone who would change my life in ways I had never imagined possible. His name was Thomas Mitchell, and he was the newly appointed doctor for our rural county, fresh from medical school at the University of Alabama, full of idealistic plans to improve health care for the poor farming families scattered throughout our region. Our first encounter occurred at the schoolhouse where I taught. He had come to administer polio vaccinations to my students as part of a statewide public health initiative. I was organizing the children into orderly lines when he approached, me with a warm smile that immediately put me on guard. "Does the teacher need vaccination as well?" he asked with gentle humor, noting my obvious youth compared to what he had probably expected. "I've received all necessary immunizations, Dr. Mitchell," I replied with the formal distance that had become my automatic defense against unfamiliar men. "But thank you for your concern." Over the following months, Thomas began appearing at the school with increasing frequency, always with some legitimate medical reason, checking students' vision, distributing educational materials about dental hygiene, giving talks about nutrition and disease prevention. But his eyes invariably sought me out during these visits, and his professional obligations always seemed to extend into longer conversations after the children had been dismissed for the day. Resisting his obvious interest was my first instinctive reaction. The trauma of my adolescence had built walls around my heart that made me deeply suspicious of any romantic approach from men, regardless of how genuine or respectful it might appear. The few friendships I had managed to develop during my college years had been exclusively with other women, and my classmates frequently teased me about my prolonged single status without understanding the abyss of mistrust that existed within me. "You can't spend your entire life alone, Isabella," my colleague Margaret, the science teacher at our school, would say while we graded papers together in the fading afternoon light. "Dr. Mitchell is clearly a good man with honorable intentions, and he's obviously quite taken with you." "I'm perfectly content as I am," I would respond automatically, my standard defense against such suggestions. "I have my students, my family, my books. Not every woman requires a husband to feel fulfilled or complete." This was partially true. I had indeed built a meaningful, independent life without relying on romantic relationships for validation or happiness. But there was also the fear, the deep and seemingly irrational terror that any intimate relationship might somehow awaken the demons I had worked so hard to quiet. It was Aunt Louise who, with her characteristic blend of practical wisdom and gentle persistence, finally helped me recognize that I was allowing my grandfather's ghost to continue controlling my life even after his death. "I understand your fear completely, Isabella," she told me one Sunday afternoon as we prepared dinner together in her spacious kitchen. "But not all men are like your grandfather. Your own father is living proof of that truth. And if you continue running from the possibility of love and partnership, you're giving that evil man power over your future that he doesn't deserve to have." Her words struck me with the force of revelation. I was indeed allowing the specter of my abuser to dictate my limitations, my possibilities, my dreams. It was an insidious form of continued victimization that I was inflicting on myself. In the spring of 1969, I finally allowed Thomas to take me to dinner at the Grand Hotel in nearby Point Clear, a sophisticated establishment that felt impossibly elegant to someone of my humble rural background. I was so nervous that I could barely touch the elaborate meal he had ordered, my hands trembling slightly as I attempted to navigate the multiple forks and complicated etiquette. "Relax," he said, with that genuine smile that had gradually become less threatening and more comforting over time. "It's just dinner between friends. I'm not proposing marriage, yet." That "yet" should have frightened me, but instead it made me laugh. Perhaps the first truly spontaneous, unguarded laugh I had experienced in the presence of a man since my childhood ended so abruptly. There was something about Thomas's direct honesty, his refusal to pretend that his intentions were anything other than romantic, that somehow disarmed my carefully constructed defenses. Our courtship progressed slowly, with almost reverent care on his part. He seemed to sense intuitively, without my needing to explain, that there were emotional wounds in me that required time and patience to heal completely. He never pressured me for physical intimacy beyond what I was comfortable providing. Never questioned my occasional and seemingly inexplicable withdrawals from affection. Never demanded explanations for reactions that probably seemed irrational to someone who hadn't experienced trauma. One evening in late autumn, sitting by the lake that bordered our small town and watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky, I made perhaps the most difficult and liberating decision of my adult life. I told him everything. I spoke about Mama's death and the terrible vulnerability that followed. I described my grandfather's predatory behavior and the months of abuse that nearly destroyed my ability to trust anyone. I explained the night my father discovered the truth and the violent confrontation that ended with my abuser's death. I spoke without looking directly at Thomas, my eyes fixed on the dark water that reflected the emerging stars like scattered diamonds. When I finished my account, there was a long silence that stretched between us like a bridge I wasn't sure we could cross. Finally, I gathered the courage to look at him directly, expecting to see disgust, rejection, or at minimum the kind of awkward pity that would signal the end of our relationship. Instead, I found tears streaming silently down his face. "Isabella," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for trusting me enough to share something so deeply personal and painful. I can't imagine the courage it required. Not just to survive what you experienced, but to become the extraordinary woman you are today." He took my hands in his, a gesture that was both protective and respectful of my boundaries. "Nothing you've told me changes how I feel about you. If anything, my admiration and respect have only deepened. You are one of the strongest, most resilient people I've ever known." We were married in June of 1970, in a simple ceremony at the same Episcopal church where Aunt Louise worshipped. It was a modest country wedding with reception in the parish hall, food lovingly prepared by the women of our community, and music provided by a local bluegrass band. The early years of our marriage required patience and understanding from both of us. Despite my conscious decision to trust Thomas completely, my body retained memories that my rational mind couldn't always override. There were nights when I woke screaming from nightmares, moments of inexplicable panic, triggered by innocent gestures, reactions that seemed disproportionate to anyone who didn't understand their origins in past trauma. Thomas, with the patience that comes from genuine love, stood beside me through every setback and celebrated every small victory in my ongoing healing process. "We're not in any hurry," he would say whenever I apologized for my limitations or expressed frustration with my slow progress. "We have our entire lives ahead of us to build something beautiful together." In 1972, our family was blessed with the birth of our first child, a healthy boy we named David, in honor of my mother, Margaret. The pregnancy and delivery were complicated by traumatic memories that transformed what should have been a joyful experience into a psychological ordeal. But when the nurses placed that tiny, perfect bundle in my arms, and I looked into his wide blue eyes, so much like my own, something profound and healing occurred within me. "I will protect you," I whispered to my newborn son, making a promise that echoed the one my own father had made to me, though his had come tragically late. "Nothing and no one will ever hurt you as long as I draw breath. You will grow up safe and loved and free from the shadows that haunted my childhood." It was a vow that connected me to the universal chain of mothers throughout history who have fought to give their children better lives than they themselves had known. 2 years later, our family was completed with the arrival of our daughter, Catherine, a determined little girl with dark hair and an infectious laugh who displayed remarkable strength of character from her earliest days. The 1970s passed quickly, in a blur of diaper changes, first steps, first words, family trips to visit Thomas's parents in Mobile, sleepless nights with feverish children, and countless small domestic joys that gradually healed the deepest wounds in my heart. I continued teaching, eventually becoming principal of the same school where I had begun my career. Balancing motherhood with professional responsibilities wasn't easy, but I had learned early in life that I was capable of carrying heavy loads when circumstances demanded it. In 1982, at the age of 35, I faced another significant loss when my father died suddenly of a massive heart attack while working in the small vegetable garden he maintained behind Aunt Louise's house. He was found by a neighbor, collapsed, among the tomato plants he had been tending with such care. He was only 59 years old, far too young to leave us, but perhaps his heart had simply carried too much sorrow and responsibility for too many years without adequate rest or healing. The funeral took place in the same small cemetery where we had buried my grandfather so many years earlier, and later my beloved mama, standing beside his grave as the red Alabama soil was shoveled over his simple coffin. I was struck by the profound irony that this cemetery now held both my protector and my destroyer, my salvation and my tormentor. As we gathered there, a sudden storm began building on the horizon, massive black clouds advancing rapidly across the sky, bringing with them fierce winds and the first heavy drops of what would become a torrential downpour. It seemed as though nature itself was paying tribute to this quiet, strong man who had done what needed to be done to protect his daughter, and who had carried the weight of that necessary action for the rest of his life, without complaint or self-pity. "Even the weather came to say goodbye," Samuel observed. My brother, now a 33-year-old man with a family of his own. 3 children who would grow up knowing their grandfather only through the stories we would tell them. The rain began, pouring down in earnest just as the last shovelful of earth covered Daddy's coffin. Most of the mourners hurried for the shelter of their cars, but our immediate family, Samuel, Rebecca, Aunt Louise, Thomas, and my young children, remained there in the downpour. We stood together, letting the warm Alabama rain wash over us in what felt like an involuntary baptism, somehow appropriate for this final farewell to the man who had ultimately saved us all, even though his heroism had come at such a terrible cost. It was at that moment, soaked to the skin but strangely at peace, that I realized how fundamental my faith had become to my survival and recovery. Not a dogmatic or ritualistic faith, but a deep confidence that even in life's most devastating storms, there exists a greater purpose and meaning that we don't always immediately understand. This faith hadn't arrived through any dramatic religious conversion or sudden spiritual epiphany. Instead, it had grown slowly, through all the trials I had endured and overcome. It had taken root during those nights when I, still a traumatized child, had looked up at the stars and felt a loving presence that transcended my limited understanding. It had strengthened when, against all reasonable odds, I had found in Thomas not just a husband, but a true partner who helped me rebuild the trust I thought had been permanently destroyed. God writes straight with crooked lines, Aunt Louise used to say, and though I hadn't fully comprehended this statement in my youth, with maturity, it had gained profound meaning for me. How else could I explain that an abused, traumatized girl who had nearly been destroyed could not only survive but flourish? How could I account for the fact that, despite everything I had endured, I had discovered love, created a family, and built a meaningful career dedicated to nurturing other children? How could I understand that hands which had once been violated and wounded were now capable of healing, teaching, and creating beauty in the world? Throughout the years that followed Daddy's death, this faith sustained me through other trials and challenges. It was with me when David suffered a serious automobile accident at 16 that left him hospitalized for weeks and required months of painful physical therapy. It remained strong when Catherine, at 21, announced she was pregnant and the young man she had been dating had disappeared upon learning the news, leaving her to face single motherhood with only our family's support. It didn't abandon me even when, in 1997, Thomas was diagnosed with an aggressive form of lung cancer that would claim his life in less than 8 months, despite having never smoked a cigarette in his entire life. During the 6 months that I cared for him at home, watching this strong, compassionate man gradually waste away, despite every medical intervention available, I questioned many times the reason for such suffering and apparent injustice. Why did someone so good, so dedicated to healing others, have to endure such pain and depart so early, at only 56 years old? Why, after everything I had already survived and overcome, did I need to face this additional heartbreak? I didn't find easy answers to these questions. Perhaps there aren't any simple explanations for life's deepest sorrows. But I discovered that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about continuing to trust and hope, even when fundamental questions remain open and unresolved. On the night Thomas died, I was alone with him in our bedroom, my children having stepped out to call the hospice nurse and notify our pastor of his impending death. I held his hand, already growing cold and weak, while he struggled for each increasingly difficult breath. "Don't be afraid," I whispered, repeating the same words he had spoken to me so many times during the nights when nightmares had tormented my sleep. "I'm here with you. You're not alone." His eyes, clouded by morphine but still lucid and aware, found mine one final time. With visible effort, he managed to articulate his last words to me. "You are the strongest person I have ever known, Isabella. Don't ever forget that." He departed peacefully, just as he had lived, with dignity and grace. And although the pain of losing him felt almost unbearable, I also experienced a strange sense of peace, a certainty that our love didn't end with his physical death, that there was something eternal and indestructible about the bond we had forged together. The years of widowhood that followed were another period of reconstruction and redefinition. I retired from teaching but remained active in our community, working particularly with organizations that supported women and children in crisis situations. Perhaps because I understood better than most how crucial it is to have someone believe in you when your entire world seems to be collapsing around you. I had the profound joy of watching my children grow into remarkable adults who exceeded every hope I had harbored for their futures. David followed in his father's footsteps, pursuing medicine and specializing in pediatric surgery, a choice that didn't surprise me, given his compassionate nature and his intimate understanding of how healing can transform lives. Catherine, after raising her daughter Sarah as a single mother with grace and determination, eventually earned her law degree and now works as an advocate for victims of domestic violence and child abuse. When she told me about her career choice, I felt a deep sense of completion, knowing that my experiences, however painful, had somehow contributed to her passion for protecting the vulnerable. My grandchildren, I have 6 of them now, grew up hearing stories about the grandfather they never knew, about great-grandmother Margaret, who died so young, and about life in rural Alabama during a simpler but often harsher time. But I never shared with them the darkest chapters of our family history. Some truths are simply too heavy for young hearts to carry, and perhaps they will never need to know those particular details. The important lessons about resilience, about the power of love to overcome evil, about the importance of protecting the innocent. These they absorbed naturally through our family's actions and values, rather than through explicit storytelling. Today, at 79 years old, I sit on the same type of wooden porch where this story began, though now it overlooks a small garden in the comfortable retirement community where I've chosen to spend my final years. Time has silvered my hair completely, etched lines of experience across my face, and slightly bent my shoulders, but it has not been able to diminish the strength that was forged in the fires of those early trials. The seasons continue their eternal cycle here in Alabama. Spring still brings the explosion of color from dogwood and azalea blossoms. Summer still presses down with that familiar heat that makes the air shimmer like liquid crystal. Autumn still paints the landscape in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. And winter still brings the occasional frost that transforms the world into something magical and pristine. But I view these natural rhythms now with the perspective that comes from having lived through many seasons of the heart as well. Periods of devastating loss and unexpected joy, times of profound darkness and surprising light, years of struggle and seasons of peace. If I could somehow speak to that 11-year-old girl who lost everything in a single day, her mother, her innocence, her trust in the world, I would tell her that the road ahead will be far more difficult than she can possibly imagine, but also that she possesses an inner strength she doesn't yet know exists. I would tell her that the scars will never completely disappear, but that they can become sources of wisdom rather than simply reminders of pain. I would explain that the wounds that seem impossible to heal today can become the very foundations of her ability to help others tomorrow. Most importantly, I would tell her that she is not alone, that there are good people in this world who will extend helping hands when she needs them most, and that there is a divine love that will sustain her even when human love seems to have failed completely. This is my story. A story of trauma, yes, but ultimately a story of redemption and hope. A story about how faith, love, and simple human decency can triumph over the darkest evil when people choose to act with courage rather than look away from uncomfortable truths. A story that demonstrates how one person's survival and healing can create ripples that extend far beyond their own life, touching future generations and strangers who may never know the source of the kindness they receive. Throughout my long life, I have encountered countless other survivors, women and men who carry their own invisible scars from childhood trauma, domestic violence, sexual assault, and emotional abuse. Some have found their way to healing and wholeness, while others remain trapped in cycles of pain and self-destruction. The difference, I've observed, often lies not in the severity of what they endured, but in whether they encountered even one person who believed them, supported them, and helped them understand that their worth as human beings was not diminished by what others had done to them. This is why I finally decided to share my story publicly, despite the discomfort and vulnerability it requires, not for myself. I have learned to carry my past without being crushed by its weight. But for anyone who might be struggling in silence right now, wondering if they will ever feel safe or whole again, if you are that person, please know that your story is not over yet. The chapters of pain and fear you're living through now do not define the ending of your book. There are people who will believe you when you find the courage to speak. There are resources available to help you escape dangerous situations. There are therapists and counselors trained to help you process trauma and rebuild your life. Most importantly, there is hope. Real, substantial hope for a future that can include joy, love, meaningful work, and the kind of peace that comes from knowing you have not only survived but have transformed your pain into something that can benefit others. Your healing may not look exactly like mine. Your path forward may take different turns and require different kinds of support. But the fundamental truth remains. You are stronger than you know, more valuable than your abusers ever told you, and worthy of a life filled with safety, respect, and genuine love. The monsters that hurt you, whether they share your blood or not, whether they sit at your dinner table or lurk in other places, do not have the final word in your story. You do. Your choices, your courage, your decision to seek help and keep moving forward, these determine how your story ends. As I near the end of my own earthly journey, I find myself reflecting on the patterns and purposes that have emerged from what once seemed like random suffering. The little girl who was broken by evil became a woman who dedicated her life to protecting and nurturing other children. The daughter who couldn't save her mother became a mother who fiercely protected her own children, and through her teaching, career, countless other people's children as well. The trauma that could have destroyed my ability to trust and love instead became the foundation for a marriage built on radical honesty and mutual support. The faith that was tested in the crucible of unimaginable pain emerged stronger and more resilient, capable of sustaining not just me, but others who have drawn strength from my example. This doesn't mean that I'm grateful for the abuse I suffered. I would never trivialize trauma by suggesting it was somehow worth it, for the lessons it taught or the person it helped me become. Evil is evil, and there is no justification for what my grandfather did to me, or what any abuser does to their victims. But I am profoundly grateful for the people who helped me survive and heal. My father, who ultimately chose to protect his child even at great personal cost. Aunt Louise, who provided both practical support and the wisdom that comes from shared experience. Thomas, who loved me with the patience and gentleness my wounded heart required. My children, who gave me new purpose and motivation to continue growing and healing. I am grateful for the teachers who recognized my potential when I couldn't see it myself, for the community that rallied around our family during our darkest times, for the colleagues who became friends and the students who became like my own children. I am grateful for every small kindness that helped rebuild my trust in humanity's capacity for goodness. Most of all, I am grateful for the opportunity to have lived long enough to see my pain transformed into purpose, my scars become sources of strength, and my story become a testament to the human spirit's incredible capacity for resilience and renewal. If my account has touched your heart in any way, I ask that you share it with others who might need to hear this message of hope and survival. Please take a moment to like this video so that it can reach more people who are struggling with their own dark chapters. Subscribe to this channel if you want to follow other true stories of overcoming adversity and finding purpose in pain. Leave a comment sharing where you're watching from, knowing that my story has reached you, wherever you are in the world, brings me great comfort and joy. In the end, what saves us is not the absence of suffering. That's an impossible dream in this broken world, but the presence of love in its many forms. The love of family members who refuse to abandon us even when we're difficult to love. The love of friends who see our potential when we can't. The love of strangers who extend unexpected kindness. The love of mentors who invest in our growth. The love of partners who choose to build something beautiful with us, despite our scars. And underlying all of these human expressions of love, there is what I have come to understand as divine love, a cosmic force for healing and redemption that works through ordinary people doing extraordinary things for each other. This love doesn't always prevent terrible things from happening, but it ensures that terrible things never have the final word. It transforms victims into survivors, survivors into thrivers, and thrivers into healers who can help others make the same miraculous journey from darkness into light. Today, as I watch children play in the garden outside my window, children who will never know the specific fears that shaped my early years, I am filled with gratitude for every person who chose love over fear, action over inaction, courage over comfort. Their choices made it possible for that terrified little girl to become the woman who could tell this story, and their legacy lives on in every life that will be touched by her words. The monsters are real, and they do terrible damage, but love is stronger than fear. Truth is more powerful than secrets, and hope can survive even the darkest nights. May this truth sustain you, wherever you are in your own journey from surviving to thriving. May you find the helpers when you need them most, and may you become a helper for others when your own healing allows it. And may you never forget that your story, like mine, is still being written, and you have more power than you know to determine how it ends. God bless you, and thank you for listening. The end.